In the ruthless, male-dominated world of 1960s Washington, they dismissed Katharine Graham as a fragile, grieving socialite. They never imagined that this quiet woman who was often too terrified to even speak in meetings would become the one person a paranoid president couldn't break. How did the most underestimated woman in America become its most powerful? Her story is hard to believe, but ironically, it begins with the death of the man everyone thought was the star of the show, her brilliant husband. His tragic end should have been the end of her dynasty. Instead, it was the beginning of her fight, a fight for a kingdom forged by the iron will of her father and almost destroyed by the brilliant madness of her husband. June 1933. Inside a federal courthouse auction room, the Washington Post was dying. In a Washington, D.C. ravaged by the Great Depression, it wasn't just a failing newspaper, it was a joke, a journalistic corpse waiting to be buried. The auction was a somber affair. Everyone was just waiting to pick apart the bones. Suddenly a man appeared, completely out of place in the crowd. His name was Eugene Meyer, a titan of Wall Street, a retired financial wizard, a man of immense wealth. What was he doing at the funeral of a worthless newspaper? To everyone's astonishment, Meyer's lawyer began to bid. He never hesitated, crushing every rival with a cold confidence. Finally, the gavel fell. The paper was sold for $825,000. All of Washington was stunned. The biggest question was, why? Why would a man as shrewd as Meyer pour his money into a sinking ship? The answer would change the history of American journalism. Meyer wasn't buying a business. He was buying a soul for the nation's capital. He believed that power needed to be watched, and he wanted to forge a weapon for the truth. In an era where newspapers were personal weapons for rich owners, Meyer declared war on the old guard. He announced a single radical principle that would change American journalism forever. The newspaper's duty is to its readers, and no one else. Meyer poured his sweat, tears, and millions of dollars into resurrecting the paper. But when it came time to find a successor, he did the unthinkable. He didn't choose his own son. Instead, he began to prepare and stake the paper's future on his son-in-law, a brilliant, charming, rising star named Philip Graham. Phil seemed to be the perfect choice to take Meyer's legacy to new heights. But they didn't know that behind that perfect facade lay a terrible secret, a storm that was about to consume everything and thrust a shy, underestimated woman into the center of the most brutal power struggle of the 20th century. The moment Philip Graham took the publisher's desk at the Washington Post, it was as if a jolt of pure electricity had been shot through the building. The post-war era was a time of boundless American optimism, and Phil Graham was its perfect embodiment. He was young, handsome, and bristling with an energy that was both infectious and slightly intimidating. While Eugene Meyer had been the stern, methodical architect who laid the foundation with gravitas and grim determination, Phil was the master builder, ready to erect a skyscraper with dazzling speed and flair. He wasn't just content to run the paper his father-in-law had saved. He was determined to make it the most important and influential publication in the world. He had a vision that extended far beyond the Beltway, and he possessed the charm, the intellect, and the political savvy to make it a reality. In the newsroom, he was a revelation. He could stride through the clatter of typewriters, greeting reporters by name, cracking a joke with a copy editor, and then retreat to his office to hold court with senators and cabinet secretaries. He had an intuitive grasp of power and how it worked in Washington. He understood that a newspaper's influence was not just in what it printed, but in the access and relationships its leaders cultivated. He moved effortlessly through the city's corridors of power, not as an observer, but as a player. He transformed the Post from a merely respected paper into an essential one, a required daily read for anyone who mattered in the capital. His phone calls were always returned, his invitations were always accepted. To be in Phil Graham's orbit was to be close to the center of the universe. Phil Graham wasn't content just running a newspaper, he was building an empire. His first target, his biggest rival, the Washington Times-Herald. In a lightning-fast secret deal, he conquered them, shutting down their presses overnight and making the Post the undisputed king of the city. But being a city king wasn't enough. In 1961, he snatched up Newsweek magazine, seizing a voice that echoed across the nation. Philip Graham wasn't just in the news business anymore, he was in the power business. He was at the absolute pinnacle of his profession, a media mogul who was courted and feared in equal measure. His influence was perhaps felt most acutely in the political arena. He wasn't just a reporter of events, he was a participant. He became an intimate friend and confidant to the most powerful men of his generation. He was particularly close to two towering figures of the Democratic Party, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. He was a key member of the informal kitchen cabinet that advised JFK, offering counsel on everything from policy to political appointments. His most significant and historically controversial act of political maneuvering came during the 1960 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Kennedy had secured the presidential nomination after a grueling primary season, but the choice of a running mate was critical. Many in Kennedy's liberal northern camp were fiercely opposed to the idea of selecting the Texan Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson. The two men were political rivals and personally disliked each other. The Kennedy camp, led by the candidate's brother Robert, viewed LBJ as a crass Southern vulgarian, a relic of an older political world. Phil Graham, however, saw the political calculus with brilliant clarity. He understood that Kennedy, a Catholic from Massachusetts, desperately needed Johnson on the ticket to win the conservative Protestant South and secure the election. He acted as a relentless back-channel negotiator, a one-man shuttle diplomacy mission between the two camps. He cajoled Kennedy's team, arguing that victory was impossible without Texas. He massaged Johnson's considerable ego, convincing the proud Senate leader that the vice presidency was not a political dead end, but a position of real power. For a frantic 24 hours, he shuttled between their hotel suites, brokering a deal that seemed impossible. In the end, he succeeded, playing a pivotal role in forging the ticket that would ultimately win the White House. He was a kingmaker, operating in the shadows where true power resides. To the outside world, Phil Graham's life was a perfect, glittering tapestry of success. He was married to the intelligent and devoted Katharine, the daughter of the revered Eugene Meyer. They had 4 beautiful children, Dawn, Lally, Bill, and Stephen, and lived a life of immense privilege, hosting elegant dinner parties at their Georgetown home where political and journalistic royalty mingled. He was the golden boy, the man who had everything: wealth, power, influence, and a seemingly perfect family. But behind this dazzling facade, a terrible darkness was gathering, a secret storm that threatened to destroy everything he had built. Philip Graham suffered from what was then called manic depression, a brutal cyclical illness that we now know as bipolar disorder. In the 1950s and early 60s, mental illness was a topic shrouded in shame and ignorance. It was seen not as a medical condition, but as a character flaw, a sign of weakness. There were no effective targeted medications like lithium, and therapy was often a shot in the dark. For Phil and for his family, it was a terrifying and confusing ordeal. The illness manifested itself in dramatic swings of mood and behavior that grew more pronounced over time. During his upper manic phases, he was a force of nature. His energy was boundless, his ideas brilliant and grandiose. He could work for days with little sleep, his mind racing with plans for expansion and political machinations. It was in these phases that he was at his most charismatic and successful. His charm turned up to an almost supernatural level. But it was also when he was at his most reckless. He would make impulsive decisions, spend money lavishly, and exhibit an unnerving intensity that could verge on megalomania. Then inevitably, the down phase would come. The glittering energy would vanish, replaced by a crushing, debilitating depression. He would become withdrawn, morose, and filled with a profound self-loathing. The world would lose its color, and he would retreat into a gray fog of despair, unable to face the demands of his job or his family. Katharine, known as Kay, bore the brunt of this terrifying cycle. She loved her husband deeply and tried desperately to understand the disease that was consuming him. She became his caretaker, his protector, trying to shield the world from his erratic behavior and shield him from the consequences of his own actions. It was a lonely, exhausting, and heartbreaking vigil. She walked on eggshells, never knowing which version of her husband she would wake up to, the brilliant charmer or the despondent recluse. As the years progressed, the illness grew worse, the cycles more extreme and more public. By the early 1960s, Phil's behavior was becoming impossible to conceal. He began drinking heavily, which only exacerbated his mood swings. The brilliant mind that had once charmed presidents began to turn cruel, especially towards the person closest to him. He would lash out at Kay, belittling her in front of their friends and children, mocking her intelligence and her background. His brilliant mind, once a source of charm, now turned cruel. He lashed out at Kay, belittling her in front of their friends, mocking her intelligence in front of their children. With every public humiliation, he chipped away at her soul, reinforcing the one belief she held deepest, that she was not good enough. He seemed to need to tear her down to build himself up, a classic and tragic symptom of his spiraling condition. The final catastrophic spiral began in 1962. During a trip to Phoenix for a newspaper convention, Phil, in the throes of a powerful manic episode, met a young Australian freelance journalist named Robin Webb who was working for Newsweek. He became instantly infatuated. He abandoned the convention, flew off with Webb, and began a flagrant, very public affair. He returned to Washington and announced to a stunned Kay that he was leaving her and wanted a divorce. He was not discreet. He traveled openly with Webb, introducing her as his new partner. He even began the legal process of rewriting his will to leave control of the Washington Post Company to her. He became a spectacle, a subject of whispered gossip throughout the tight-knit world of Washington. The man, who had been a pillar of the establishment, was now its most notorious rogue. His mania reached a terrifying peak at a newspaper publishers' convention in Phoenix in January 1963. He was not scheduled to speak, but he grabbed the microphone during a speech and launched into a rambling, incoherent tirade. He was drunk, disheveled, and completely out of control. He railed against his friends, revealed confidential political secrets, and loudly announced his affair to the horrified audience, crudely describing his plans for his future with Webb. Friends and colleagues, including the publisher of the New York Times, finally managed to get him off the stage. He was flown back east on a private plane, where he was forcibly sedated and committed to Chestnut Lodge, a private psychiatric hospital in Rockville, Maryland. For the next several months, he was a patient, undergoing therapy and treatment. Kay, despite the deep public and private humiliation he had inflicted upon her, stood by him. She put a stop to the divorce proceedings and the attempts to change his will. She visited him regularly, managed the affairs of the company in his absence, and held her family together with a quiet, steely resolve that surprised everyone, including herself. By the summer, Phil seemed to be improving. He was calmer, more rational, and deeply remorseful for his behavior. He pleaded with his doctors and with Kay to let him come home, just for a weekend. He promised he was better. Against their better judgment, but swayed by his apparent recovery and Kay's own desperate hope for a return to normalcy, his doctors consented. On a hot Saturday in August 1963, Phil Graham was released from Chestnut Lodge for a weekend visit to Glen Welby, the family's beloved country farm in Virginia. The day was quiet. He and Kay spent time together, talking, walking the grounds. There was a fragile sense of hope in the air, a possibility that perhaps the worst was over. That afternoon, Phil said he was tired and wanted to take a nap. Kay went to her own room to rest. A short time later, the deafening roar of a gunshot echoed through the quiet house. Philip Graham, the brilliant, charming, and tormented man who had built a media empire, was dead at the age of 48. He had taken his own life with one of his favorite shotguns. The golden era was over, ending not with a flourish, but with a sudden, violent, and tragic silence. In its wake, a stunned and grieving widow, a woman the world saw as nothing more than a shy socialite, was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life and a teetering empire. The sound of that gunshot at Glen Welby didn't just end a life, it shattered a world. For Katharine Graham, the immediate aftermath was a blur of surreal, numbing horror. The shock was absolute, a physical blow that left her reeling. In one devastating moment, she was no longer a wife, but a widow. The man she had loved, the brilliant, tormented center of her universe for over 2 decades, was gone. The logistics of death took over with a brutal, impersonal efficiency. The police, the coroner, the endless, agonizing phone calls. The funeral was a major Washington event, a somber affair attended by the highest echelons of power. President John F. Kennedy, though not present, sent his deepest condolences. A final gesture of respect from one power broker to another, just months before his own tragic end. Kay stood through it all with a quiet, almost unnerving composure, a stoic mask concealing a maelstrom of grief, confusion, and a terrifying uncertainty about the future. The public saw a dignified widow. Her close friends saw a woman in a state of profound shock, moving through a fog of disbelief. As the initial wave of grief began to recede, it was replaced by a new and even more daunting reality. The Washington Post Company was now hers. The succession was not a matter of debate or corporate maneuvering. It had been decided years earlier by her father, Eugene Meyer, in an act of patriarchal foresight. When he sold the company's voting stock to Phil and Kay for $1, the legal documents stipulated that if Phil died, his shares would revert not to his estate, but directly to his wife. Her father, perhaps sensing the fragility beneath his son-in-law's brilliant exterior, had ensured that the newspaper he loved would remain in the family, specifically in the hands of his daughter. At 45 years old, this shy, unassuming woman who had spent her entire adult life in the shadow of powerful men was suddenly the head of a major American corporation, and almost no one believed she could do it. The prevailing attitude in the deeply patriarchal world of 1960s business was not just skeptical, it was overtly dismissive. The men on her own board of directors, men who had worked for her father and her husband, saw her as a temporary placeholder, a grieving widow who would need to be managed. They treated her with a kind of gentle, patronizing condescension, calling her Kay in meetings, while referring to each other as Mr. They would explain business concepts to her in the simplest of terms, as one might to a child. Their private conversations, which inevitably leaked back to her, were filled with speculation about when she would sell the company, or at the very least, appoint a proper male publisher to run it in her stead. The idea that she herself would take the reins was considered preposterous, a notion so outside the bounds of convention as to be laughable. The world of high finance and corporate governance was a men's club, and she was an intruder, there only by a tragic accident of fate. The men on the board saw a grieving widow, a placeholder, and the terrifying truth was, Katharine believed they were right. At her first board meetings, her hands shook so violently she had to hide them under the table. She would pre-write her remarks, but when the moment came to speak, surrounded by a sea of suits, her voice would vanish. More than once she fled to the ladies' room to cry, convinced she was an imposter about to run her family's legacy into the ground. Every decision felt monumental, every interaction fraught with peril. She was paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake, of proving everyone right. This was the crucible in which Katharine Graham was forged. Her transformation from a timid socialite into one of the most powerful women in America was not a single dramatic event, like a scene from a movie. It was a slow, painful, and incremental process, a testament to a deep reserve of grit and intelligence that she herself didn't know she possessed. It was a journey of 1,000 small steps, each one a minor victory over her own fear. It began with a simple act of showing up. She went to the office every day. She claimed the publisher's office, her late husband's office, as her own. It was a symbolic act, a declaration to herself as much as to others, that she was not going away. Then she began to listen. She sat in on meetings not as a participant, but as a student, absorbing the rhythm and language of the business. And she began to read. She read everything she could get her hands on: financial reports, circulation numbers, advertising data, internal memos. She took them home at night and studied them, trying to build a framework of knowledge from the ground up. She started asking questions tentatively at first, often prefacing them with, "This may be a stupid question," but she sought out a few key allies who believed in her, men who saw past the grieving widow to the intelligent woman beneath. The most important of these was Fritz Beebe, the company's chairman of the board and a longtime family lawyer. Beebe was a calm, kind, and profoundly decent man who became her trusted mentor and guide. He never treated her as a fragile widow. He treated her as the boss. He would patiently explain the intricacies of finance and corporate strategy, encouraging her to find her own voice, to trust her own judgment. His unwavering support was an anchor in the storm of her self-doubt. She also began to use the tools she did know. She was a masterful hostess, a skill she had honed over decades. She turned her elegant Georgetown home into an unofficial headquarters, a salon where she could gather journalists, politicians, and business leaders. In this more familiar setting, on her own turf, she could engage with them on her own terms, learning, probing, and slowly building the network of relationships that had been her husband's great strength. It was a way of stepping into the role of publisher through a side door, using her social skills as a formidable business asset. She learned that she could get more information and build more trust over a dinner party than in a stuffy boardroom. But her single most important decision, the one that would define her legacy and that of the newspaper, came in 1965. The Post needed a new top editor. The paper was good, it was profitable, but it lacked a certain fire, a competitive edge. It was seen as a bit staid, a bit too close to the establishment it was supposed to be covering. Kay knew she needed someone with swagger, someone who was unafraid to challenge authority and pursue stories aggressively. She needed a disruptor. Her choice fell on Benjamin C. Bradley. Ben Bradley was, in many ways, the journalistic equivalent of Phil Graham. He was a Boston Brahmin, educated at Harvard, with a gravelly voice, a confident swagger, and an almost pathological hatred of being beaten on a story. He was a war hero, a close friend of President Kennedy, and had been the Washington bureau chief for Newsweek. He was also charming, profane, an old-school newspaperman who believed that the job of the press was to print the news and raise hell. Many on the board and in the newsroom were wary of Bradley. He was seen as a maverick, too risky, too much of a troublemaker. The old guard at the Post preferred a more cautious, responsible approach to journalism. But Kay saw something in him, a shared commitment to excellence and a passion for the news that mirrored her own growing sense of purpose. She saw the man who could make her paper not just good, but truly great. In her first major act of executive authority, she overruled the doubters and named him managing editor. He would later be promoted to executive editor. It was the beginning of one of the most legendary partnerships in the history of American journalism. Their relationship was not always smooth. They argued, they clashed, but beneath it all was a foundation of deep, unshakable mutual respect. He pushed the paper to be tougher, more investigative, more willing to take on the establishment, and she in turn backed him, providing the crucial support from the publisher's office that gave him the freedom to build a world-class newsroom. He was the tip of the spear, and she was the unbreakable shaft. Under Bradley's editorial leadership and Graham's steadying hand as publisher, the Washington Post began a remarkable transformation. Bradley recruited a stable of brilliant, hungry young reporters, men like Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, and David Broder. He fostered an atmosphere of intense competition and intellectual rigor, a place he called a creative tension newsroom. The paper became sharper, its writing more vibrant, its investigations more penetrating. It was no longer just the most important paper in Washington. It was beginning to set the national agenda. For Kay Graham, this period was one of profound personal growth. She was learning not just how to run a business, but how to lead. She traveled the world, meeting with heads of state and business titans, representing her company on the global stage. She joined corporate boards, often as the only woman in the room, forcing herself to speak up, to offer her opinions, to hold her own against men who were still unaccustomed to treating a woman as an equal. Each small victory, each successful negotiation, each well-received speech built upon the last, slowly constructing a new identity. The insecure, deferential wife was gradually being replaced by a confident, decisive executive. She was finding her voice, and she was discovering that it was a powerful one. She was also learning to take risks. Journalism, especially the kind Ben Bradley practiced, was a high-stakes game. It involved confronting powerful people, challenging official narratives, and publishing uncomfortable truths. For a publisher, this meant being willing to face lawsuits, political pressure, and financial threats. It required a backbone of steel. The quiet years of her transformation from 1963 to the early 1970s were a period of preparation. She was honing her skills, building her team, and solidifying her authority. She didn't know it yet, but she was getting ready for the fight of her life. Two of the biggest political and constitutional crises of the 20th century were looming just over the horizon. And Katharine Graham, the unlikely matriarch who was once too afraid to speak in meetings, would be standing right at the center of the storm. The year 1971 found America in a state of profound turmoil. The Vietnam War, a conflict that had once been a distant rumble, had become a raw, gaping wound in the national psyche. It dominated every facet of public life, fueling bitter protests on college campuses, tearing families apart at the dinner table and casting a long, dark shadow over the presidency of Richard Nixon. The official government line carried over from the Johnson administration was one of steady progress and a clear, noble purpose, halting the spread of communism. Yet a growing chasm had opened between what the government claimed and what the American people were beginning to suspect. A deep-seated cynicism was taking root, a sense that the country was being systematically lied to about the origins, the conduct, and the prospects of the war. It was against this backdrop of suspicion and division that one of the greatest confrontations between the press and the government in American history was about to erupt. On Sunday, June 13, 1971, the New York Times dropped a bombshell. The front page carried the first installment of a series of articles based on a massive top-secret government study. Officially titled History of U.S. Decision-Making Process on Vietnam Policy, it would become known to the world simply as the Pentagon Papers. This was no mere leak. It was a 7,000-page, 47-volume secret history commissioned by former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara himself, detailing 3 decades of American foreign policy in Southeast Asia. Its contents were devastating. It revealed a consistent pattern of deliberate deception by 4 successive presidential administrations: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. It showed that, contrary to public statements, the government had systematically enlarged the scope of the war, misled the public about its progress, and harbored deep private pessimism about the chances of victory, even as it sent hundreds of thousands of young men to fight and die. At the Washington Post, the Times story landed with the force of a thunderclap. Ben Bradley was apoplectic. The Times had the biggest story of the decade, and his paper had been completely scooped. It was a journalist's worst nightmare, a major professional humiliation. He immediately put his own reporters on a frantic mission to figure out what the Times had and, more importantly, to get their own copy. For Katharine Graham, the initial feeling was one of competitive envy, but that quickly gave way to a dawning awareness of the story's immense gravity. The Nixon administration's reaction was swift and furious. President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were enraged not so much by the revelations about their predecessors, but by the principle of the leak itself. They saw it as a dangerous breach of national security, an act of treason that undermined the government's ability to conduct foreign policy. Attorney General John Mitchell sent a telegram to the Times demanding they cease publication, arguing that it would cause irreparable injury to the defense interests of the United States. When the Times defiantly published a second installment, the Justice Department took an unprecedented step. It went to federal court and obtained a temporary restraining order, forcing the most powerful newspaper in the country to stop publishing. It was the first time in American history that the federal government had successfully censored a major newspaper prior to publication. The legal battle was on, and the entire journalistic world held its breath. Meanwhile, at the Post, the hunt for the source of the leak was intensifying. The source, as the world would later learn, was Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department analyst who had become a disillusioned anti-war activist. Driven by conscience, he had painstakingly photocopied thousands of pages of the report and was determined to get it out to the public. Seeing that the Times had been silenced by the courts, Ellsberg knew he needed another outlet. Through a series of intermediaries, a connection was made to Ben Bagdikian, an assistant managing editor at the Post. What followed was a sequence of events worthy of a spy thriller. Bagdikian flew to Boston, met with Ellsberg in a motel room, and was given 2 massive boxes filled with thousands of pages of the classified report. He bought a seat for the boxes on a flight back to Washington and smuggled them into Ben Bradlee's Georgetown home. On the floor of Bradlee's library, a team of the Post's top editors and reporters, including Bradley Bagdikian and managing editor Howard Simons, began the Herculean task of sorting through the mountain of disorganized documents. They worked in a state of frenzied excitement and mounting dread, surrounded by Chinese takeout containers and overflowing ashtrays, racing against the clock to make sense of the material and prepare it for publication. As the journalists worked, another, more consequential drama was unfolding. The Post's lawyers and business advisors were horrified. The company was on the verge of a momentous event, its first public stock offering. After years of being a private, family-owned enterprise, the Washington Post Company was about to go public, a move essential for its long-term financial stability and growth. The timing could not have been worse. The company's lawyers, led by the firm of Royal, Kogel, and Wells, delivered a dire warning to Katharine Graham. Publishing the Pentagon Papers, they argued, would be a catastrophic mistake. The New York Times was already under a federal injunction. If the Post published the same material, it would be held in contempt of court, a clear violation of the Espionage Act. The legal consequences could be devastating. Massive fines, criminal prosecution for the editors and the publisher, and even the possibility of jail time. The business implications were just as terrifying. The lawyers warned that a federal indictment would almost certainly trigger a standard material adverse change clause in the underwriting agreement for the IPO, allowing the banks to pull out of the deal. The stock offering would collapse. Furthermore, the company owned several television stations whose broadcast licenses were granted by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and subject to renewal. The Nixon administration could easily use its power to challenge those licenses, threatening the most profitable part of the company. In short, publishing the papers could financially ruin the company that her father had saved and her husband had built. Her chief business advisor, Fritz Beebe, a man she trusted implicitly, was deeply worried. He advised extreme caution, siding with the lawyers. The pressure on Katharine Graham was immense, coming from every direction. Her legal team was united against publication. Her financial advisors saw it as corporate suicide. The most powerful men in the country, the president and the attorney general, had already shown they would use the full force of the government to stop the story. And she was still, in her own mind, the accidental publisher, the woman who had inherited her position through tragedy. All her old insecurities came rushing back. Who was she to risk her family's entire fortune, the livelihoods of her employees, and her own freedom on a single decision? The final agonizing debate took place over the phone on a Tuesday afternoon. Bradley and his editorial team were at the office, their story ready to go. Kay was at her home, hosting a party for a retiring employee. The key players were all patched into a tense conference call. Kay at her house, Bradley and his editors at the paper, and Fritz Beebe and the lawyers in New York. The lawyers made their case one last time, forcefully and urgently. They laid out the legal risks in stark, apocalyptic terms. Then Bradley and his team made their case. For them, it was a matter of principle. The Times had been silenced. If the Post backed down now, the government would have successfully intimidated the press into submission. The story was of vital public importance, and it was their duty as journalists to publish it. If they caved, Ben Bradley argued, the Post would become a laughingstock, a nice little fat timid newspaper, and he would be forced to resign. The call ended. The decision rested solely with Katharine Graham. She was alone in her library, the weight of her father's legacy, her husband's ambition, and the future of her company on her shoulders. She thought about the immense risks, the warnings of the men she trusted, But she also thought about the purpose of the newspaper as her father had defined it, a duty to the readers and the public at large. She thought about the partnership she had forged with Ben Bradley, built on the promise of creating a truly great, courageous newspaper. To back down now would be to betray everything they had worked for. She picked up the phone again and called her editors. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Go ahead. Let's go," she said. "Let's publish." In the newsroom, a cheer erupted. For Katharine Graham, it was the moment of her final transformation. The insecure widow was gone, replaced by a leader of profound courage and conviction. She had been tested in the ultimate trial by fire, and she had not flinched. The Washington Post published its first article on the Pentagon Papers on Friday, June 18th, 1971. As expected, the Justice Department immediately sought an injunction. A frantic legal battle ensued, with the Post's lawyers fighting in district court and then the Court of Appeals. The case, now combined with that of the New York Times, raced to the Supreme Court. On June 30th, 1971, in the landmark case New York Times Kobe v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the newspapers. The majority opinion affirmed the press's First Amendment protections against prior restraint, with Justice Hugo Black writing one of the most powerful defenses of a free press in American history. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. It was a monumental victory. It cemented the First Amendment rights of the press, vindicated Katharine Graham's courageous decision, and elevated the Washington Post to the absolute front rank of American journalism, standing shoulder to shoulder with its rival, the New York Times. Katharine Graham had risked everything, and in doing so had not only saved her paper's soul, but had also defended a cornerstone of American democracy. The battle was over, but the war with the Nixon administration had just begun. The president and his inner circle would not forget the humiliation. An enemies list was already being drawn up in the White House, and the Washington Post, along with its publisher, was right at the top. The victory in the Pentagon Papers case was a moment of profound triumph, but it left a dangerous aftertaste. In the White House, the mood was not one of grudging respect, but of simmering, vengeful fury. President Richard Nixon and his inner circle now viewed the Washington Post not as a legitimate journalistic institution, but as a sworn political enemy. An enemies list was being compiled, and Katharine Graham and her newspaper were at the very top. They had won the battle, but in doing so, had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the world, a man who held grudges with a pathological intensity, and who had at his disposal the full, formidable apparatus of the federal government. The stage was set for a conflict that would dwarf the fight over the Pentagon Papers, a scandal that would begin not with a grand leak of classified documents, but with a seemingly trivial crime in the dead of night. In the early morning hours of Saturday, June 17th, 1972, a security guard named Frank Wills was making his rounds at the Watergate, a sprawling, luxurious hotel and office complex overlooking the Potomac River. He noticed a piece of tape over the latch of a door in the basement garage, holding it unlocked. He removed it, thinking nothing of it. When he passed by again a short time later, the door had been retaped. Wills, his suspicions now aroused, called the D.C. police. A handful of plainclothes officers responded and began a floor-by-floor search. On the 6th floor, inside the dimly lit offices of the Democratic National Committee, DNC, they found them. 5 men dressed in business suits and wearing rubber surgical gloves, caught in the act of burglarizing and attempting to bug the headquarters of the opposition political party. They were professionals, equipped with cameras, lock-picking tools, and electronic surveillance equipment. It was a strange, bizarre crime, but on the surface it seemed like just another police blotter item. The story landed on the city desk of the Washington Post, where it was initially seen as a local crime story, albeit an odd one. It was assigned to a young, hungry, and relatively new reporter named Bob Woodward. Woodward, a Yale graduate and former naval intelligence officer, was known for his obsessive work ethic and his relentless, almost robotic pursuit of facts. He was sent to the arraignment of the 5 burglars. In the courtroom, something struck him as deeply strange. The men weren't your typical burglars. They were well-dressed, had a high-powered lawyer, and one of them, James McCord, whispered to the judge that he had recently retired from the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Woodward started digging. He was soon paired with another young reporter, Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was in many ways Woodward's opposite. Where Woodward was a buttoned-down Midwestern Republican, Bernstein was a scruffy, chain-smoking college dropout, a product of the counterculture with a reputation for brilliant, if sometimes chaotic, writing. They were an unlikely pair, and their editors, particularly Metropolitan editor Harry Rosenfeld, teamed them up with some trepidation, but together their skills were perfectly complementary. Woodward was the master of getting inside sources and extracting information. Bernstein was the master of synthesis, of seeing the larger pattern and writing it into a coherent narrative. They became a single, formidable reporting entity known in the newsroom as Woodstein. Their initial reporting was a masterclass in what journalists call shoe leather reporting. They spent countless hours knocking on doors, making endless phone calls, chasing down the thinnest of leads. A crucial early break came when Woodward discovered a slip of paper in one of the burglars' address books with a name E. Howard Hunt and the notation W House or WH next to it. Hunt was a former CIA operative who was now working as a consultant for Charles Colson, a top aide to President Nixon. The connection, however tenuous, led directly to the White House. The White House, for its part, was quick to dismiss the story. On June 19th, just 2 days after the break-in, Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, contemptuously described it as a third-rate burglary attempt and declared that the White House has had no involvement whatsoever in this particular incident. For most of the National Press Corps, that was the end of it. It was a bizarre local story, a caper, and they moved on to cover the presidential election campaign. But Woodward and Bernstein, under the watchful eyes of their editors Howard Simons and Barry Sussman, refused to let it go. They kept digging, and they began to uncover a secret world of political espionage and sabotage, all funded by a secret slush fund connected to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, derisively known as CREEP. They found a key source in Judy Hoback Miller, the bookkeeper at CRP, who revealed that records were being systematically destroyed. A crucial breakthrough came when they traced a $25,000 cashier's check, which had been deposited in the bank account of one of the burglars, back to a fundraiser in the Midwest and then directly to the coffers of CRP. The story was no longer just about a break-in. It was about a conspiracy, a trail of money that led from the burglars directly to the president's re-election campaign. As their investigation deepened, Woodward began to rely on a source he had cultivated from his time in the Navy. This source was a high-level official in the executive branch, someone with immense knowledge of the inner workings of the Nixon administration. They met in secret, under cloak-and-dagger conditions, in a dark underground parking garage, with signals arranged in advance, a red flag and a flower pot on Woodward's balcony. The source would never be quoted directly and would speak only on deep background, providing guidance, confirming information, and keeping the reporters on the right track. In the newsroom, this source was given a nickname, a play on the title of a popular pornographic film of the day, Deep Throat. His identity, FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, would remain one of Washington's best-kept secrets for 3 decades. Deep Throat's famous advice to Woodward became the reporter's mantra, "Follow the money." For months, as the 1972 election approached, the Washington Post stood virtually alone on the story. While other news organizations were reporting on the campaign trail, Woodward and Bernstein were publishing a steady stream of explosive articles, connecting the Watergate break-in to a broader, massive campaign of political spying and sabotage directed by top Nixon officials. The White House response was no longer dismissive. It was openly hostile. The administration unleashed a coordinated campaign to discredit the Post and its reporters. Ziegler attacked their stories as shabby journalism, the shoddiest type of reporting, full of hearsay and incalculable falsehoods. Nixon's allies and surrogates accused the paper of being a partisan tool of the Democratic Party, trying to smear the president on the eve of his re-election. The pressure on Katharine Graham was becoming unbearable. The attacks were not just political, they were personal and financial. At a party in California, Frank Stanton, the head of CBS, warned her that the White House was out to get her. The threat to the company's television station licenses in Florida became very real. A group of Nixon associates filed a formal challenge with the FCC to block the renewal of the Post's licenses for 2 stations in Jacksonville, a move that could have wiped out 1/3 of the company's profits. It was a clear, unambiguous act of political retaliation designed to financially cripple the Post and force its publisher to back down. The most infamous threat came directly from the Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell. In late September, Carl Bernstein called Mitchell, who was the former head of CRP, to get a comment on a story that would directly implicate him in controlling the secret fund. Mitchell erupted in a rage. "All that crap, you're putting it in the paper," he yelled. "It's all been denied. Katie Graham's going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer if that's published." Bernstein was stunned. He calmly wrote down the quote verbatim. It was a crude, misogynistic threat directed squarely at his publisher. When he reported it to his editors, the shock was palpable. This wasn't just political hardball. This was a threat of personal and corporate destruction from the highest law enforcement officer in the land. In the publisher's office, Katharine Graham was terrified. She was being assailed daily by the most powerful men in the world. Her company's stock price was falling. Some of her friends in the Washington establishment were quietly telling her she was going too far, that she was endangering her family's company for the sake of a murky story pursued by 2 overly zealous young reporters. The feeling of isolation was immense, yet she never once wavered in her support for her newsroom. When Ben Bradley told her about the threats, about the immense pressure, about the very real possibility that they might be wrong, her response was simple and resolute. She backed her editor. She trusted him, and he trusted his reporters. She provided the unwavering, unconditional support that was essential for the story to continue. She absorbed the pressure from the White House, from Wall Street, and from her own board of directors, creating a protective shield around her journalists so they could do their work. Her courage was not loud or flamboyant. It was a quiet, steely resolve. It was the resolve of a leader who had been through the fire and was no longer afraid of the heat. In November 1972, Richard Nixon was reelected in one of the largest landslides in American history. It seemed for a moment that the Watergate story would be buried, that the Post had failed. But the reporting continued. The turning point came in the courtroom of Judge John Sirica, who presided over the trial of the original burglars. Sirica, known as Maximum John, was convinced that a larger conspiracy was being covered up. He used the threat of long prison sentences to pressure James McCord, the ex-CIA agent, to talk. In March 1973, McCord finally cracked, writing a letter to the judge claiming that high-ranking officials had perjured themselves during the trial and that the burglars had been paid hush money to stay silent. The dam had broken. The Senate established the Watergate Committee, and its televised hearings, led by Senator Sam Ervin, captivated the nation throughout the summer of 1973. One by one, former White House and campaign officials came forward, most notably former White House counsel John Dean, who delivered devastating testimony about a cancer on the presidency and directly implicated President Nixon in the cover-up. Then came the ultimate bombshell. White House aide Alexander Butterfield revealed the existence of a secret voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office that had recorded virtually every conversation the president had. The fight was now over the tapes. The Post's lonely crusade had become a full-blown constitutional crisis, pitting the president against both Congress and the Supreme Court. On August 9, 1974, facing certain impeachment by the House of Representatives and conviction by the Senate, Richard Nixon became the first and only president of the United States to resign from office. In the newsroom of the Washington Post, there was no celebration. There was only a quiet sense of relief and somber vindication. For 2 years, they had pursued a story against overwhelming opposition, enduring threats, ridicule, and profound isolation. They had done their job. Katharine Graham, the woman once dismissed as a fragile socialite, had presided over one of the greatest moments in the history of journalism. Her decision to stand by her reporters and her principles in the face of unprecedented pressure had not only brought down a corrupt presidency, but it also cemented the Post's reputation as one of the world's greatest newspapers, a powerful symbol of a free press as the ultimate guardian of democracy. The trial by fire was over. The resignation of Richard Nixon on August 9, 1974, was not just the climax of a political scandal. It was the dawn of a new age for the Washington Post. In the space of 3 short years from the Pentagon Papers to Watergate, the newspaper had transformed itself. It was no longer just a respected capital city paper. It was a global institution, a journalistic legend. The name itself became synonymous with fearless, investigative reporting. Applications from aspiring young journalists flooded the newsroom. The paper's circulation and profits soared. For Katharine Graham, the transformation was even more profound. The shy, uncertain widow had become arguably the most powerful woman in America. She was an icon, a symbol of courage and integrity, who had faced down a corrupt president and won. She was celebrated around the world, a publisher of immense stature and influence. The Post and the Graham family had reached the zenith of their power and prestige. The years immediately following Watergate were a golden age. The newsroom, under the continued swaggering leadership of Ben Bradlee, was flush with cash and confidence. It pursued ambitious investigative projects, expanded its foreign bureaus, and won a string of Pulitzer Prizes. The Post wasn't just reporting the news, it was setting the national agenda. Yet, even at this moment of supreme triumph, the seeds of future challenges were being sown. The world was changing, and the forces that would eventually upend the entire newspaper industry were beginning to gather like distant storm clouds. By the late 1970s, Katharine Graham began to contemplate the future and the delicate matter of succession. She was determined to keep the newspaper in the family, to pass the torch to a 4th generation. Her eldest child, Donald E. Graham, had been preparing for the role his entire life. Don was, in almost every respect, the temperamental opposite of his charismatic grandfather, Philip Graham. Where Phil had been dazzling, impulsive, and a natural creature of the political elite, Don was quiet, methodical, and deeply, almost painfully humble. He had none of his grandfather's flamboyant charm, but he possessed his own formidable strengths, a sharp analytical mind, an unshakable sense of duty, and a profound, almost spiritual devotion to the newspaper and its mission. Don Graham's path to the publisher's office was not one of privilege. After graduating from Harvard, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving during the Vietnam era, a quiet act of duty before he ever wore the mantle of publisher. Upon his return, he did not take an executive office at the Post. Instead, he joined the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, spending 18 months as a patrolman on the city's toughest streets. It was an unconventional choice, one that spoke to his desire to understand the city his family's paper served from the ground up. When he finally did join the company, he started at the bottom, working his way through various departments, from advertising sales to the production floor, learning every facet of the business with a quiet diligence. He was universally respected for his work ethic and his complete lack of arrogance. In 1979, Katharine Graham made the formal transition. At the age of 61, she stepped down as publisher, handing the title to her 34-year-old son, Don. She remained chairman of the board and CEO of the Washington Post Company, continuing to guide the corporation's overall strategy. But the day-to-day responsibility for the newspaper now rested on his son's shoulders. The pressure on Don was immense. He was succeeding a living legend, a mother who had become a global icon for her role in one of the most significant events of the 20th century. The shadow she cast was long and imposing, and many wondered if the quiet, unassuming son could possibly live up to the legacy of his mother and the brilliance of his grandfather. For the first decade of Don Graham's tenure, the Post continued to thrive. The 1980s were a period of great profitability for the newspaper industry, but beneath the surface, the ground was beginning to shift. A new technology was emerging from university labs and government research projects, a global network of interconnected computers that would come to be known as the Internet. In its early days, it seemed like a niche curiosity for academics and hobbyists. Few in the traditional media world recognized it for what it was, an existential threat. For decades, the Post was a license to print money, but Don Graham was now facing a force his family had never imagined, the Internet. And he could only watch as this new world tore his empire apart piece by piece. The classified ads, the river of gold that had funded reporters in war zones, were obliterated overnight by a single free website called Craigslist. The bedrock of their business had simply vanished. And here was the cruelest irony. Great journalism couldn't save a broken business model. Under Donald Graham's leadership, the Washington Post was not ignorant of these changes. In fact, it was one of the earliest and most aggressive adopters of digital technology among traditional newspaper companies. They launched a website, WashingtonPost.com, in 1996, and invested heavily in building a digital presence. Don Graham, with his analytical mind, understood the technological shift far better than many of his peers. The company poured hundreds of millions of dollars into various digital ventures, trying to find a new model that would work in the internet age. But the challenge was immense. The culture of a print newsroom was difficult to change. For years, the website was treated as a secondary concern, a place to simply dump the contents of the print paper. More fundamentally, no one could figure out how to make online advertising as profitable as the old print ads had been. An online banner ad sold for pennies on the dollar compared to a full-page print ad. They were fighting a war of attrition against an economic reality they could not change. In the digital world, the price of information and advertising was plummeting towards zero. The 2000s were a period of agonizing slow-motion decline. The paper that had once been a license to print money was now facing years of declining profits, followed by mounting losses. The golden age was definitively over. The company was forced to make a series of painful decisions. They offered buyouts to veteran reporters, shrinking the size of the newsroom that was the paper's heart and soul. They closed foreign bureaus. They implemented hiring freezes and pay cuts. For Don Graham, a man who cared deeply about his employees and the institution, each cut was a personal torment. He was presiding over the dismantling of the very thing his family had spent generations building. The family's vast fortune, which had once seemed limitless, could no longer sustain the newspaper's losses indefinitely. The Washington Post Company was still profitable, thanks to its other assets like the Kaplan Education Company and its cable television holdings. But the newspaper itself, the flagship, the cultural and emotional core of the enterprise, was becoming an unsustainable drain. The cruel irony was that the Post's journalism remained excellent. It continued to win Pulitzer Prizes and produce work of immense public service. But great journalism could not by itself solve a broken business model. By the early 2000s, Donald Graham was forced to confront a terrible reality. He had spent his entire professional life trying to navigate the digital transition, but he had come to believe that he was not the right person to lead the paper into the future. He concluded that the family, for all its love and dedication, could no longer provide the financial resources, the runway, as he called it, needed for the Post to survive and hopefully thrive. The paper needed a new owner, someone with not just incredibly deep pockets, but also a native understanding of the digital world, someone who wasn't bound by the traditions and legacy of the print era. It was an incredibly difficult and painful conclusion to reach, an admission that his family's 80-year stewardship was coming to an end. It meant letting go of his family's identity, of the public trust they had held for 4 generations. But he believed it was the only way to save the institution. The goal was no longer to keep the Post in the Graham family. The goal was to ensure the Post itself survived. The decision, once made in the quiet of Donald Graham's mind, set in motion a process of almost unprecedented secrecy. To sell the Washington Post, the crown jewel of his family's legacy and a pillar of American democracy, was not a simple business transaction. It was a deeply personal and emotional act of surrender, and he knew that if word leaked out prematurely, the process would descend into a media circus, causing immense pain to his employees and potentially scuttling any chance of a successful deal. The institution was already fragile. A public prolonged auction would be a death blow to its morale. So he moved with the stealth and precision of a covert operative. In early 2013, he approached a single, highly discreet investment banker, Allen & Company, known for its deep connections in the tech and media worlds. He gave them a simple yet monumental task: find a buyer. But not just any buyer. He wasn't looking for the highest bidder, a private equity firm that would strip the company for parts, or another media conglomerate that would be beholden to quarterly earnings reports. He was looking for a unicorn, an individual with 3 specific qualities. First, they needed almost limitless personal wealth, enough to sustain the newspaper through years, perhaps even decades, of continued losses and investment. Second, they needed a genuine, demonstrable commitment to the public service mission of great journalism. And third, they needed a long-term vision, a perspective that measured success not in fiscal quarters, but in generations. The list of potential candidates was infinitesimally small. Allen and Company drew up a list of about a dozen names, a who's who of the American billionaire class, including figures like Michael Bloomberg and Warren Buffett. But one name on the list was particularly intriguing: Jeff Bezos. Bezos, the founder and CEO of Amazon, was the quintessential digital native. He had built one of the world's most valuable companies by systematically disrupting and then dominating traditional industries, from bookselling to retail. He was known for his relentless focus on the customer, his willingness to make huge long-term bets, and his almost fanatical devotion to technological innovation. He was also, by 2013, one of the richest men on the planet. Don Graham was intrigued but skeptical. He knew Bezos only by reputation and had no idea if he had any interest in the struggling newspaper business. The initial approach was made with the utmost discretion. An investment banker reached out to Bezos asking for a meeting on behalf of an unnamed iconic national institution. Bezos agreed. When they finally met, Graham laid his cards on the table, explaining the newspaper's dire financial situation and the family's painful conclusion that they could no longer be the stewards the institution deserved. He wasn't delivering a sales pitch. He was explaining a problem, seeking a successor. Bezos was initially hesitant. He knew nothing about the newspaper industry and was already consumed with running Amazon. But he was a voracious consumer of news. And as Graham spoke, he became increasingly fascinated by the challenge. He saw the Post not as a broken business, but as a vital institution with a globally recognized brand that was failing to adapt to the new digital reality. He was intrigued by the parallels to his own business, the relentless focus on the reader, the customer, the need for long-term investment, and the transformative power of the Internet. They began a series of quiet, intense conversations, conducted in secret meetings in Sun Valley, Idaho, and at Bezos's home in Seattle. What emerged was a personal connection, a meeting of minds between the old guard publisher and the new age tech titan. Graham became convinced that Bezos possessed the unique combination of resources and vision the Post so desperately needed. Bezos, for his part, came to see owning the Post not as a business venture, but as a profound civic responsibility, much as Eugene Meyer had 80 years earlier. He promised Graham that he would not interfere with the newsroom's journalistic independence and that his primary goal was to find a sustainable path for the Post's future, no matter how long it took. The negotiation was swift and deeply personal. They settled on a price of $250 million in cash. To many, the price seemed shockingly low for such a legendary institution, but it reflected the brutal reality of the newspaper's financial state. It was not a sale of the entire Washington Post company, only of the newspaper and its affiliated publications. The Graham family would retain the profitable parts of the company, like Kaplan and the broadcast stations, which would be rebranded. This was about finding a new home for the newspaper itself. The deal was finalized in the late summer of 2013. Until the moment it was announced, only a tiny handful of people, fewer than 10, knew it was happening. On the afternoon of August 5, 2013, Donald Graham gathered the staff of the Washington Post in the main newsroom. The atmosphere was anxious. Rumors of more buyouts and budget cuts were always swirling, but no one was prepared for what came next. With his voice thick with emotion, his niece and the paper's publisher, Katharine Graham, standing by his side, Don Graham announced that his family, after 80 years of continuous ownership, had sold the Washington Post. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a stunned, deafening silence. People looked at each other in disbelief. Some reporters began to cry. It felt like the world had tilted on its axis. The Grahams were the Washington Post, The institution and the family were inextricably linked in the minds of everyone who worked there and in the mind of the public. It was the end of not just a business, but a dynasty, an entire era in American journalism. Then, Graham announced the buyer's name, Jeff Bezos. The shock deepened into a profound sense of dislocation and uncertainty. What would this titan of e-commerce, a man known for his ruthless efficiency, do to their beloved newspaper? In a letter distributed to the staff, Don Graham laid out the painful but necessary logic of his decision with characteristic honesty and humility. The Post could have survived under the family's ownership and been profitable for the foreseeable future, he wrote, but we wanted to do more than survive. I'm not saying this guarantees success, but it gives us a much greater chance of success. It was his final act as steward, a painful sacrifice made to give the institution he loved a future. The Graham dynasty is over. Their 80-year reign is a story of power, tragedy, and the brutal cost of truth. Eugene Meyer, the patriarch, bought the paper's soul when it had none. Philip, the brilliant, tragic prince, built it into an empire before being consumed by his own demons. Katharine, the reluctant queen, the underestimated widow who stared down a president and won. And Donald, the faithful son, who made the ultimate sacrifice, selling his family's birthright to save its soul. Their story is an eternal reminder that journalism at its best is never just a business. It is a sacred trust, a trust paid for in tears, in courage, and in sacrifice.